just would like to say about partners' commitment to resiliency in this moment is that we've spent a lot of time developing this framework, thinking about civil society's preparedness for future shocks within the civic space, dealing with democratic challenges that we're facing. And now we're making a very quick pivot to using the framework for adapting in our current context. And the one thing that we're quite proud of, the way that we both developed the framework and are implementing it now, and we're currently piloting this way of improving resiliency in about 8 countries around the world. The thing that we're proud of is that it's a framework that promotes a way of thinking about resiliency, a change of mindset, discussions around adaptation within organizations, but that we've convened a lot of different experts and compiled a lot of different resources to support civil society's resiliency. And so today's webinar, inviting Natalie to join us and share her perspective on adaptive leadership, is the beginning of sharing those resources and the experts and the resource partners that we've been cultivating for over 3 years that we're really looking forward to sharing with our broader community. So with that, just Natalie, thank you for joining us. And we look forward to continuing the conversation with many of you throughout the next months, because we know that this is a challenging time and we need to be supporting each other with these conversations. Go ahead, Ali.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Julia, for that, and Ali for introducing me. And I'm delighted to see some faces and to welcome you all to this webinar. As Ali said, the more you put your video camera on, the more interactive we can be and the more connection we can get. So please go ahead if you feel like it. I'm thanking Partners Global for inviting me to do this webinar. I know that we have quite a lot in common. And resilience is very fundamental to our organization. We are an organization that specializes in resilience. We work in organizational resilience, helping companies, helping employees, helping leaders to become more resilient and to deal with change and challenge. And we work in all different sectors. So we work with the private sector a lot. We also work with the UN because we're based here in Switzerland, and we work with various NGOs as well. And to be honest with you, adaptive leadership, the needs are identical for every sector. So hopefully I can share some of the experiences that we have here at PEPIT, and you'll see how they might be relevant for your particular organization or for other organizations that you know of. Now, we see in the private sector and in most of our clients, they all have certain challenges. And I'm aware that in the civil society space, there are a number of challenges. I'm going to name just 2 or 3 that I'm aware of, which is difficulties with regards to funding, maybe a shrinking civic space, maybe government clampdown or difficult legislation. Those are just 2 or 3 of many that I know of. And so I understand and I realize that this is such an important topic for the civic space. Now, I thought that I might just run through the objectives of today. So the first objective that we're going to be talking about is we're going to introduce to you the concept of organizational resilience, so how we at PEPIT, we see it. Then we're going to be talking about the 3 C's for resilient and adaptive leadership. And then we'll be sharing with you a case study from one of our clients that needs and that is still needing to move towards innovation and transformation. So I'd like to get some participation going right now. When I say to you resilience, can you tell me what are the words that spring to mind? Just put them on the chat. Use the chat function. Tell me what are the words, the first word that springs to mind when I say resilience. Coping. Thank you. Absolutely, coping. Thank you very much. Any other ones? Flexibility, adaptation, yes. Flexibility, rebound, okay. Tolerance, yep. Bouncing back, agile, indeed. Persistence. Oh, I see I've got a very savvy audience here. Yes, that's wonderful. Elasticity, transcendence, overcoming. Wow, you're overwhelming me with your interpretation of resilience. So what I'm gathering from that is you are already very familiar, and that's not a surprise to me because I know that there are many organizations in the civic space that are indeed very resilient. But let me share with you our way, the way in which we look at it. We use 3 simple words. The first word is adapt. So it's a capacity for organizations and their staff to be able to adapt to the changing and challenging situations. The second word is to sustain, because whatever the challenge or whatever the change, usually it's not temporary, it will go on for some time. And so the organization needs to be able to sustain, or if you like, survive. And the third one, which is extremely close to my heart, is to grow. And this really is in keeping with the Partners Global's resiliency framework, where we talk about a forward momentum, about being prepared, about anticipating, and not just surviving, but actually thriving, growing through change. So that's us in a nutshell. I just want to share with you now a little bit about how we work. So when we go in and we help a client or we help an organization, we work across 3 levels. The first level is the organizational level. And here we are working with human resources, senior management, and really addressing the whole culture of the organization. So it's a real high level approach. The second level that we work with is leadership, because the leaders are the role models. They're the ones who are going to be delivering the messages to the organization. They are the change agents, and they are the ones who are going to be developing and helping their team. And lastly, we work at an individual level with all employees. They are the ones who are going to need to adapt and grow and learn flexible mindsets to move with the change. And we have actually an analysis that we do where we go into companies and we assess the resilience at all these 3 levels. And it's interesting to know that each level has different indicators. So for example, you might have a team of people who are, in which there are a number of resilient people, but that doesn't make the team itself resilient. So it's important to understand that each level has its own indicators. So this is really interesting as well, because what I found by talking to more and more with Partners Global is that they have a great resiliency framework, which I'm sure you've been looking at and you've heard of. And so this resiliency framework is really interesting because there are, well, as you can see, there are 7 different parts to the framework. And actually, we find ourselves, PEPIT, fitting in very nicely into 2 of them, or maybe 3 of them. Resiliency ethos, which we'll be mentioning later on, adaptive capacity, preparing for the unknown, and I think we're a little bit in the narrative as well. So it's interesting to see how what we're talking about today fits in very nicely with the work that global partners have been doing. So one thing that it's important to think about when we go into organizations who are in change or who are in transformation, many of them, the first thing they think about, the first thing they prepare for is the systems, the processes, the operations. That's often the first point of call. And there aren't that many organizations that pay attention to the culture. Okay, so what we're talking about today is not just so much the operations, but we're actually talking about how an organization can go about changing the culture, which is no mean feat. It's not something that happens overnight, and it takes a lot of work, but that is the area that we at PEPIT are concerned with, changing the culture. Interesting, I'm just wondering, what do you think when I mean culture? What words spring to mind for you guys? Can you share on the chat? What do you think culture is? Let's see. Anything, any words that spring to mind? Here we go. Behavioral norms, informal practices. Yep. Values, absolutely. Shared values. Yes. Fantastic. I can see some more coming. Practices, beliefs. Yeah, you've got it. You've got the idea. Culture is really about. It's about, first of all, it's about the mission, the mission, the purpose, the values. It's about the work environment, and it's about the people. The people really have to be at the center of every culture. So without further ado, I'm going to move on to the second part, which is now talking to you about our model. And our model is the 3 C's for adaptive leadership. So this is a model that we have defined and we've also put together thanks to a lot of research that we've done with the university here in Switzerland when we looked at what makes leadership resilient and adaptive. So the first part of the first part is all about a caring and coaching environment. So here what we mean basically is that organizations really need to ensure that their managers are able to support and care for their staff. In these difficult times right now in the pandemic, we've been working in the last 2 weeks flat out with managers, helping them to support their staff who are anxious, who are worried, who are feeling disorientated, helping them to be coaches, helping them to coach their staff and support them. So that's the first element. The second element is a connected leadership. So what do I mean by a connected leadership? So basically a connected leadership does a number of things. Firstly, it connects its team to the purpose. So to engage and to motivate your team needs to be connected to its purpose. So it articulates and often refers to the purpose. Secondly, it's a good feedback culture. So the leader encourages feedback, knows how to give feedback, encourages its team to give feedback. And there's also an element there of praise as well. Praise is something that is very rarely done in organizations. So helping the leaders develop a culture of praise as well. Something else we also tackle within this area is empathy and assertiveness. So a lot of leaders, usually they fall on one side or the other. There are some excellent leaders that manage to balance both. When are you empathetic or when are you assertive, and how can you get the right balance? And that's super important. So that's in a nutshell what we do in the second section. And then the last one is creative. And this is really embracing that forward movement that I mentioned earlier. How do you get your staff, your team, your members to be creative? Because after all, that's what we need in times of crisis. We want them to be innovative and we want them to rise above the challenge. So the first aspect that we're going to talk about actually today, and we've picked this one because we think it's interesting, is growth mindset. I'm going to come back to that later, but it's really about mindset. The second one that we do in this area is all about psychological safety. So there's no way that you can get your team to create or to innovate if they don't feel safe. They're not going to come up with ideas or suggestions if they don't feel safe. So that's helping the leader to make a safe space so people feel free to suggest and to innovate and are not worried about failing as well. And then a couple more things in this sector. There's one about agile decision making, which I will also touch upon later when we have our questions, because somebody sent us a question, which is, I'm going to talk about agile decision making. And lastly, learning. So learning is a fundamental part of resiliency and adaptive behavior. I know that global partners have that in their framework. So it's about how the team manager, how the leadership can encourage learning. And here we're not talking about getting external consultants in. It's more about learning lessons and sharing lessons and being able to use what you learn as you move forward. So those are the three C's that we use. And so now what I'd like to do is I'd like to just share with you briefly a case study. So we're going to move on to the third part of this. I just want to pause for a second and just see if you've got any questions while I'm going through, because I'm aware that I'm giving you quite a lot of information. Please feel free to put your questions in chat, and I will try and incorporate them as much as I can. So moving on now to the case study. So this is a company that we've been working with. It's a Fortune 500 company, international company, and they have been going through a huge product transformation. Literally, their old product has disappeared, and it's a company that's been going for over 100 years. So everybody was very comfortable with this product, and they had been doing extremely well. But for different reasons, of course, I can't talk too much about that, but for different reasons, they had to change their product. And so this involved a restructure, an internal restructure. It involved a new focus on skills and competencies. And as a result, for a while, there was no more learning and development within the organization. And there was a huge focus on operations, systems, processes, logistics, IT, all of that was a high priority. But guess what? The human side was a bit left to one side, unfortunately. And they started to feel the effects of that after a while. And so what happened? So what happened concretely is that there was a sharp rise in absenteeism and stress-related illnesses. There was an increasing amount of burnout among senior management. There was a deterioration in the social climate, and they were also starting to lose high potential staff who no longer wanted to work in that kind of environment. So it wasn't a great situation. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you what we did. But before that, I want to talk about the growth mindset, because what we found in this organization is that they had to be creative and they had to be innovative. But a lot of the problems they were having meant their staff just couldn't do it. They couldn't move into that creative zone. And so we realized quite quickly that the growth mindset, which I shared with you earlier, was very important. So I've been talking about this growth mindset for a bit. Some of you may have heard about it. I'm sure you have. It's very fashionable at the moment. So let me share a little bit about what it is. So I'm sharing with you this picture of the brain. You can see the 3 parts of the brain. And what's important to know is that when we are challenged or when we're in crisis, very often we function a lot with our limbic brain. That's the unconscious brain, and it's the emotional brain. And what happens is that this kind of hijacks the neocortex, it hijacks our rational or our thinking brain, and it makes things very difficult for us. And in fact, as humans, we have, in the face of change, we have 3 reactions. So when we lead from fear, and often that's what happens when we're in change, we go into this fight, flight, or freeze mode, which many of you will have heard of. And when we are in the fight mode, we become aggressive. And in fact, we become sometimes workaholic. And what we've been noticing in the last 2 weeks as we've been coaching and training people is that many people are working long hours right now. And they're pushing that fight mode because they're frightened ultimately, because they're fearful, and that's their mechanism, that's their coping mechanism. You've got other people who are anxious and are feeling overwhelmed, and they're in the flight mode. They're overwhelmed, maybe they're running around, they're doing 100 million things at the same time, they're multitasking, but they're not being that effective. And then for some people, and this is what we've seen as well, some people are procrastinating and struggling to move. For whatever reason, they feel that it's difficult for them to deal with this situation. And what we have to understand is that for all employees in an organization, this kind of change or challenge can be quite damaging to performance. Because what we find is that, first of all, it impairs decision making. So they find it difficult to make decisions, or sometimes they make no decisions at all. Second of all, it impairs their innovation and creation. So that's what's happening with our client right now. Well, that's what was happening with our client. And there'll be some organizations right now who might be, and perhaps some organizations in the civil society who might be right now not as creative as they could be. And lastly, it impacts collaboration, because when you're in a fearful mode, you tend to home in on yourself and you forget other people. So those are the 3 issues that can happen. So what we do is we want to encourage a growth mindset. We want people to be able to deal with that, overcome that fight, flight, and freeze behavior. And so here we come and talk about the 2 mindsets. The first mindset is the fixed mindset, okay? And I'm going to give you an example of that. And I have to be honest, we are all very often in a fixed mindset. It is totally normal to be in a fixed mindset. So for example, in a fixed mindset, we might be saying to ourselves, be good. What do we say to ourselves in a growth mindset? We say, get better, okay? So it's not about achieving, but it's about progressing. It's about, so here we are in the fixed mindset, proving, I have to prove myself. And in the fixed mindset, we say, get better. So rather than I have to prove myself, get better. And then I think there might be one more. Have we got another one there? Proving, yeah, proving, improving. So so in the proving mindset, or rather than saying I have to prove myself, I have to improve. And the other one is rather than having to demonstrate my skills, I want to develop my skills. So I think you're getting the idea there. It's rather than having to perform, it's all about learning, improving, development. You go through, you go from a premise that anything is possible, okay? It's just a question of effort and perseverance, and you will improve. So rather than performing better than others, you are performing better than you did. Okay, so that gives you an idea. So now that I've given you an idea about all of that, I think it's time to do an exercise, and Ali's going to help me with this. We're going to do some breakout rooms here. So here's the challenge for all of you, and I hope you rise to the challenge. So I'm going to give you 5 areas. Here we are: challenge, feedback, failure, personal success, and success of others, okay? And what I'm going to ask you to do in your breakout groups is to decide, with regard to those 5 areas, what does the fixed mindset say and what does the growth mindset say, okay? So with the first challenge, the first was challenge. So anybody would like to be brave enough to tell me, what in a fixed mindset, what do we think about when we think about challenge? What do we say to ourselves? Or what do we do? Anybody? Or even in the chat, let me know. What do we do?
Maybe frequent. Oh, sorry.
Yes, run away from it. Thank you. And what else?
Maybe think about it as a threat only.
Yeah, we think of it as a threat. Exactly. And the other thing is that we might give up, huh? We might give up because we find it a bit too difficult. Huh? We might give up early. Whereas in a growth mindset, what do we do in the growth mindset?
Look for options. In growth mindset, we look for solutions.
Yes. Absolutely. Growth mindset, we look for solutions. We are stimulated by challenges. It's a chance for us to develop skills and a desire to learn. So that's the difficulty, that's the difference for those 2 mindsets. And what about feedback? When you're in a fixed mindset, what do you think about feedback? Anyone?
You get
like
defensive.
it's an attack.
An attack. I like that. Absolutely, an attack. Great. It's an attack. We might take it personally. We might suffer from criticism.
Defensive.
Okay. And we've got somebody here saying you ignore useful, constructive feedback. Absolutely, that's bang on. And so in a growth, and obviously I'm going to give you the answer for the growth. In a growth mindset, we see feedback as an opportunity to learn and to grow. Okay, what about failure? When you're in a fixed mindset, what happens in failure? How do we see failure? Anything else?
Defeat.
Defeat. We see it as defeat. What else? Some people are putting up some good stuff in the chat. What else? Give up.
You're likely to
yes,
failure,
give up. Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Caroline. Yes, deny it. Thank you, Louise. Yes, deny it. And blame ourselves. You're absolutely right. You're bang on. And with failure, we often avoid taking risks and we stay in our comfort zone, okay? So obviously the opposite to that in a growth mindset is we're going to be, we will see failure as an opportunity to grow, to take risks, and we will go towards that risk zone more easily. And Julia, thank you. Yes, we will see it as an opportunity to learn and to do it better next time. Perfect. Thank you. Lex, success. Well, how is success to people in a fixed mindset? How do we view success? How does it happen, success? Who's responsible for it? That's difficult. You know what I'm going to tell you? People in fixed mindsets say it comes from external. Yes, no, Atokata, thank you, not us. We think it was a fluke. Success comes from external causes. You're absolutely bang on. And yes, and in a growth mindset, we say that success comes from effort. And the last one, how do we feel about the success of others? How other people are doing when we're in a fixed mindset? We feel threatened. Yeah, there's some good people in here. Yeah, we feel threatened. Anything else?
Envious.
Jealous. Yeah, we sure do feel jealous of people. Yeah, absolutely. Good things coming in. Huh? We don't like to we make negative comparisons, and also this might affect our self-esteem. And of course, the other side is that when we see other people who are successful, we are inspired by them. So thank you guys for taking part in that. And hopefully that gives you an introduction to what is a growth mindset. So to go back to our case study, when we went in there and we did an analysis and we looked at the growth mindset, we found that there were 3 areas in this company, and this is very typical, 3 areas that needed some help. So the first area was feedback. The first area was feedback. What we found in this company was that rather than have good feedback and helping each other, they were rather avoiding conflict, avoiding exchanging. It was very shut down in the company. And also in terms of feedback, there was very little praise. They were asking a lot of their people. They were in innovation, in transformation. And when people came up with ideas, or when people tried hard, there was no praise. And so that led to demotivation. The second area, which is very common, was learning. We found that, and this sometimes happens, that people weren't sharing information, that the left hand didn't really know what the right hand was doing. And in fact, there were lots of silos. And so there was often information that was being doubled or not really being understood properly. And so the learning processes were not agile and were not resilient. And lastly, the one which is really tricky, and it's tricky also in civil society, is risk-taking. And this was largely a problem because there was fear. And this was due to the culture. People were losing their jobs, people were being replaced because they were looking for new competencies, and people were frightened to lose their job. And because of that, they didn't dare speak up and they didn't want to take risks. And there was also within the culture an approach to failure which wasn't great. So people were blamed if they made a mistake. So those were the areas that we found. So you might say to yourself, okay, so what do we do with all of that? So I'd like to share with you now the things that we did. And I'm going to share it to you level by level. And some of them are still going on because this is a work in progress. I want to underline that. So the first thing we did, and I'm going to look at the leadership initiatives. And here we've been talking about leadership. So what did we do and how did we help them concretely? So the first thing we did was to concentrate, and you can see that here, growth mindset language, coaching and conversation guides. So what we did here was that we decided that the best thing to do was to help them with their language. So to help them develop within their way they speak, whether it's in meetings, whether it's in their communications, or whether it's to their staff, to use language that encourages effort, encourages creativity, to encourage curiosity, to use words like we and us, so that was an inclusive feeling. So those are some of the ideas that we had. And we also gave them some help on how to coach their staff, helping them with powerful questions and training techniques. So that was the first thing we did. The second thing that we did was we launched training and coaching on effective feedback and the importance of praise. So all of the line managers went through, and there was a good 400 or 500 of them in Switzerland, went through a training on how to give effective feedback, and also how to receive feedback, and also how to praise. That was very important. The third thing that we did is we helped them with their own growth mindset, so that they were able to recognize it in themselves and also recognize it when it was happening or when it wasn't happening in their team. And lastly, we worked on what I call vulnerability and failure. Quite tricky in a top-down hierarchical organization where the leaders are used to being looked up to and are expected to give all the answers. Quite difficult to be vulnerable and to say, you know what, I don't know all the answers, and to really be more human in a way. So we worked with that side, and also to ask them to encourage failure up to a certain point, obviously, but to encourage it and to allow people to make mistakes. And actually, one example I'd like to share with you is one of the ladies that I was coaching there. At the very beginning, she had to make a presentation to, she was working in media, and she made a presentation to one of the outlets, media outlets, where she was explaining the new product and why it was beneficial. And she got it wrong, actually. She got it wrong because she hadn't got all the science that she needed, and she made mistakes. It was only to one media outlet, but I have to tell you that her boss did not put her down. I mean, he could have, but he didn't. And it was that kind of attitude that gave her the courage to correct what she hadn't done right. And she went on to deliver many, many more presentations, but that's something that stuck in my mind. So that was really encouraging. So we've looked at leadership. Now, the next thing that we worked on was the organization itself, the whole culture. What did we put in at a high level? So the first thing you'll see here, and this fits in with the, oh, and sorry, can I just go back to the previous slide? Sorry, guys, something that I forgot to say, and I meant to say that with regards to leadership, the things that I was talking to you about fit in really well with the resiliency ethos and the adaptive capacity that global partners have in their model. So you can always, you'll see the link between what I'm talking about and what's in the global partners model. So going back to the organizational initiatives, so storytelling online, getting people to share their stories of success and to share their stories of failure. And this is an ongoing project right now. They're doing it by putting things online, by sharing blogs, by having senior members of the staff coming in and talking to people. The more you share and the more you talk about failures and successes, the more you encourage people. The second one was learning and development. So here, the learning and development section within HR was no longer going to be so focused on external consultants, but actually going to be more focused inwards on finding ways to create learning areas. So that people would be exchanging across cross-functionally, different teams exchanging what they've learned and finding places to store all that information. And then lastly, we did pretty much what we did with the leadership, is that to find a GM language, a growth mindset language, the fail fast, learn fast language, which they would put in their communications, in posters, in whatever worked for them. And that's still ongoing. And lastly, what about the employees themselves? So we trained and we coached employees on growth and fixed mindset. And some of them are now, and I think this is just starting, they're going to become what's called growth mindset ambassadors. So some people are being selected to promote this within the company, and they're going to be organizing events. And I'm not sure actually exactly what they're going to do, but it sounds like a good idea. So having champions is always an excellent thing to do. So what was the impact of all of that? Okay, so the impact, firstly, with regards to the organization, is that it opened up communication. People started talking, people started exchanging, there were fewer silos, and there was more of a customer focus as well. With regards to the leaders, there was more praise and more feedback, and a 360 culture really came in. And there was more solidarity and trust, and that's ongoing now. This is not something that's overnight, so it's not completely sorted, but it's ongoing. And then with regards to employees, we're seeing less absenteeism, less burnout, and they're feeling more empowered to move on. So that's me. I've talked a lot. I'm going to hand back over to Ali and Julia, who I think are going to maybe go into the Q&A. Yeah, I'll hand back over to you guys.
Great, thank you so much, Natalie, for the insights into the framework that PEPIT, that you at PEPIT Consulting have put together, and the great work that you've done. So we had a couple of preliminary questions that came to us when people signed up for the webinar, but I wonder actually, maybe even before we do that, if there are any questions from people online that would like to ask Natalie anything. And if so, feel free to give me a little hand, either one for your first question, or put up a 2 sign if it's a follow-on question to someone's previous question, okay? So if there's anyone that has a question, if not, I'm happy to read off the questions that came in before this webinar started. And I can unmute you. Not yet? Okay, so let me go to the questions then that we received ahead of time. So Natalie, the first question that we received has to do with relating the experience you have with the private sector and bringing it into lessons potentially for civil society, particularly in today's current dynamics with the global pandemic and the impacts that that's having. So given the current dynamics of today's environment and the impacts on civil society, what can civil society organizations do right now in order to take short-term immediate actions related to the adaptive leadership approach that you've presented?
Thank you, Ali. So it's a big topic, but I'm going to try and give you three tips, which I think are the most important ones right now, but there are many. So the first thing that I would say is that we talk about it in the PEPIT model, and I know you talk about it at Global Partners, is agile decision making. As a team leader, I think it's really important to look at the different styles of decision making that exist. You know, we can make decisions collaboratively, or we can make decisions more in a sort of more directive way. And during a crisis like COVID, there will be probably some decisions that need to be made in certain ways. And so establish upfront with your direct reports how and when those decisions will be made. And when you, as a manager, need to be able to make an agile decision without collaborating or without getting consensus, that's okay, and everybody accepts that. And secondly, in terms of agile decision making, we are talking here about being brave. We're being courageous, because sometimes we have to make a decision without having all of the information, which I know has been the case for lots of leaders in the last 2 or 3 weeks. So that's my first point. I think the second point I would make is really about leading from the heart. So we've been talking about caring and supporting your team. And I think now more than ever, leaders need to be in touch with that. You know, whether they've got members of their team who are isolated and suffering, which they are right now, or whether they've got members of their team who are managing a busy household and work. They need to be able to support and to connect, obviously putting health and safety first, but really putting that coaching hat and using that coaching capacity to find out how their team are doing. And then lastly, I would say I would talk about transparency, because it's very easy in a time like now for people to be confused, or for there to be misconceptions about what's expected of them or about what the organization wants. So the more that a leader is transparent and shares both what he or she knows and both what they don't know, the more that they will build trust with their team. So I think transparency is key. So I could go on and on, but hopefully I've given some good tips there.
Great, thank you so much. If there are any questions from anyone here, please give me a finger.
Yeah.
If not, I can go to the next. Let me make sure I'm seeing everyone. Okay.
Ali, I heard somebody say that they had a question.
Yeah, please.
Or maybe not.
No, you can write it in the chat, guys, if you want. If you don't want to talk, you can put it in the chat and I'll pick it up. Oh, somebody's saying they can't seem to find the hand. They can't seem to find the hand.
Oh, Susan, I can't unmute you. I'm not sure what. Oh, there we go.
Hi, everyone.
Go for it.
Hi, Susan.
I'm more used to using this on my phone than on the computer, so I can't figure out where the hand is here. Thanks very much for that presentation. It's quite insightful. And for me, I think I'm curious to also understand your perspective as a coach who goes into an organization, because when people are in crisis, they normally focus on the leadership and the organization. We hardly focus much on the employee. And for me, I look at it from, I mean, working with the employees brings in the human and social elements. And so I'm curious to know, how do you get an organization to have an interest at this point of crisis to actually have some focus on that social element? Because I find like it's really a war zone when you're trying to make them understand the importance of the social elements, also because the social elements are not seen.
It's a great question. It's a great question, Susan, and thank you so much for asking it. Because regardless of COVID, it's a challenge that we have when we go in and coach leaders in private sector. They often focused on results and focused on delivery. Particularly the top leaders, that is their focus often. And what they fail to see is that by investing in their employees and in the human side, they will get to their results and to their delivery. There's no way that you can achieve the results and delivery if you don't invest in your people. It's as simple as that. And once we try and get them, and we're really talking about emotional intelligence here, once we get them to understand that, then they open up. I don't know if that's been helpful to you, Susan, but it's really about that. Perfect. Thank you, Susan. Anybody else? No, not sure. But it's a great question. Huh? It's a problem that we have, and it's one normally you have to work with senior management right from the start to get them to appreciate that that's important.
Is there anyone else that has a question? If not, I can go to the second question that we received ahead of time. Just give me a little wave into the video. Dr. Charles Abbey, I see you waving. I'm going to unmute you.
Yes, speaking. Thanks for having me this morning.
Hello.
Hello.
What would you like to say, Charles?
Yeah, having worked in Africa for the last 15 years plus, the challenges associated with national NGOs in terms of their functions, in terms of their growth, has been a challenge. And particularly when one comes to think of how international NGOs come to partner with national NGOs, and then after 3-5 years, the international NGOs withdraw. In most cases, it leaves the national NGOs more vulnerable than even before. Even though I'm now in the US as a US citizen, I still interact with NGOs in Africa. My question to you will be then, how do we, particularly during this pandemic and post-pandemic, be able to develop resilient NGOs that will be able to prepare for pandemics? What I mean to say, their preparedness to respond to emergencies like we have, as they even continue their sustainable development, activities. Yeah. I'll be happy to hear your thoughts.
So Charles, you know what? Julia, can I hand this over to you, Julia? Because I think this is really for you, actually.
Thanks, Ali. Thank you for the question, Charles. I mean, that's exactly why Partners Global invested so much in this resiliency framework, because I think that in the past, we've been very focused on financial sustainability of local organizations, thinking that perhaps that if they had a sustainable business model that was not as reliant on international NGOs subcontracting local organizations, that would allow them to be resilient and sustainable. And I think that what we've found over time is that financial sustainability is only one aspect. And that's why these 7 factors of radical transparency, so the NGOs or nonprofits have deep connections with their constituencies, and they have legitimacy with citizens, that they are communicating in a good way, not to increase polarization in their societies, but really promoting a narrative for a vision for the government, for the society that they believe in, that is a vision of hope, for example. That all of the things about the leadership capacity, so that organizations that might be promoting, let's say, democratic governance and transparency in the rest of the world need to be living those values internally, the way that young people are promoted in leadership positions, for example. So I think there's a lot of different elements to resiliency of local non-for-profits to continue to be able to do their work. And I think that this journey of adaptive capacity, at least to start being open to things being different, is what we're hoping to start with, promoting that in nonprofits in sub-Saharan Africa and around the world. And this idea of the growth mindset champions that she mentioned within an organization, Charles, we're really committed to developing a network of resiliency champions. And, you know, Susan is one of them. She just spoke, my sister from Kenya. And so part of us convening these groupings and these discussions is so that we all start thinking about a new way of supporting civil society resiliency that isn't the old way of thinking about the model of international NGOs funding local NGOs. And I'm conscious that we're almost at time, so we're about to have to say goodbye to you all. But thank you for letting me give that last overview of how we're thinking about resiliency, Charles. You queued up my final comments perfectly.
Thank you, Julia. I don't know, have we got time for one more question, or what do you think, Ali?
No, I think we're gonna hold off on any more questions, but if anyone does have additional thoughts or insights or experiences they'd like to share, feel free to send us a note in the chat right now, or send us an email at, Luis, tell me the resiliency email again. Is it resiliency plus spelled out at partnersglobal.org? I'll put that in the chat box right now. And Natalie, I don't know if you want to say any final thoughts before we wrap up.
So no, I mean, it's been a delight to present to you, and you know, if you have any further questions, you can always contact Ali or Julia, and they can pass on any questions. And I think the only thing I can simply say is be well and be safe, and I think despite all of this, there are exciting times ahead. So I wish you all very well.
Ali, if you don't mind, I'd like to say just a final goodbye to everyone as well. And one thing that I'd like to acknowledge, and really to say thank you to Natalie and to PEPIT for presenting their thoughts and framework. And I think that we all have to be very kind to ourselves in this moment, because shifting to a growth mindset when we really may be dealing with that brain chemistry of fear, maybe we're not there yet. And maybe it's okay that we're not there yet. And to the extent that we're supporting each other as a community, to remind ourselves that this is also a moment of opportunity. At the same time, when things are feeling quite overwhelming, I think that's all right. And so, you know, part of the reason of wanting to share this information is just so that there's a consciousness of what's going on in our brain chemistry. And if you're in freeze mode right now and you're just trying to get by and take care of your kids, I think that that's also okay. But count on Partners Global to continue sharing information about adaptive leadership, about resiliency. We're going to continue to have these conversations. We hope that you'll join us. Please continue to look at our social media channels for the information that we're going to be sharing. And feel free to pass those on and to continue to be in touch with us, because we are on this resiliency journey with you at the same time, learning as we go. So thank you to Ali and to the team, and especially to Natalie for sharing your wisdom. It was wonderful to be together today.
Thank you very much. Thank you.